proceed to the second part, so the semiotics of architecture. Lecture with the title "The Presence of the Sign Towards the Phenomenological Semiotics of Architecture." Now we really address the semiotics parts. So let me first make some preliminary remarks. So architecture as a cultural technique is always social, in the sense that architecture sets the frame for the human socialization processes. Very important. This was first. So it's not that architecture is just a technique or a technology or material practice. It's social. This was first articulated by Giambattista Alberti, the Italian Renaissance theorist, in his book On the Art of Building. In 10 books, Alberti held that it was architecture and built space that made it possible for the first human beings to engage in social interaction. According to him, architecture is a precondition for socialization processes of men, and as such a precondition for the building of a human society. Without architecture, that means without well-defined places and spaces to convene and meet, no human social interaction is possible. According to Alberti, it was the establishment of architecture that fostered the basics for civil society. I think this is very important to understand about architecture. So with this lecture, I want to emphasize the fact that semiotics in architecture is somewhat different from semiotics in linguistics or in the image science. In this lecture, I want to address the special properties of the architectural sign as opposed to linguistic science. What then are the special features of architectural signs? There can be 3 points singled out. First, architectural signs are always material signs. It is their concrete materiality that distinguishes architectural signs from linguistic signs. Secondly, architectural signs have always a physical presence. And thirdly, architectural signs ask for realization of their meaning in a performative act. We call it performance. So let me make a first example. For example, there's a door. We see the sign of a door from far away. But at the same time, it is not only an abstract sign, this door here, for example, like traffic signs as abstract signs, but it is a real thing, a material thing. Furthermore, architectural signs always have a certain potential to be used according to their meaning. They offer the possibility for action. By necessity, architectural sign must be able to be used. One must be able to open the door and walk through. Otherwise, we cannot call it a door. Otherwise, the door is only a pictorial sign or an image. Images are distinct from architectural signs, and these are the special features of images. Unlike architectural elements or signs, images are two-dimensional things. Unlike architectural elements, images do not follow the laws of physics. A house in a painting can be easily turned upside down, no problem. And thirdly, images are almost immaterial. I say almost immaterial in general, as they are not bound to a certain materiality. So we can write with a pencil, in ink, we can print, whatsoever, or paint. So roughly this marks the difference between images and architecture. Now, for a first definition of semiotics in architecture, we can single out 3 cases. It is, if we focus on the material quality, we may talk about a materialist semiotics of the architectural sign. But if we focus on the physical presence, we may talk about a phenomenological semiotics of the architectural sign. And thirdly, if we address the fact that architectural signs want to be realized in action, in this case we may prefer the term performative semiotics of the architectural sign. So combining all three cases, we may now speak of a materialist, phenomenological and performative semiotics in architecture. Though, as the aspects of materiality and performance are somehow included in the term phenomenology, I propose to use the much shorter term phenomenological semiotics. As highlighted in the title of the lecture, the presence of the sign towards the phenomenological semiotics in architecture. So we come to the second part, towards the semiotics of architecture. After these introductory remarks, please let me briefly sketch the train of thought that I want to follow in my talk here. So the motivation behind choosing today's topic is that semiotics of architecture is a rather young academic discipline. It emerged in the 1960s in the context of the so-called linguistic turn or semiotic turn in the humanities. In the 1960s, semiotics became a base science not only for the humanities, but also for the arts and architecture. For architecture, though, the linguistic or semiotic turn played a special role. Because until the arrival of early modernism, the debates on communication in architecture were mainly based on the proper usage of ornaments, as we had heard. Ornaments and communication were closely linked. And ornament theory was based on classical rhetorics. But in the early 20th century, with the abolishment of ornament, through modern architecture, also communication in architecture changed. Now, with the linguistic turn, the debates on communication returned into architecture, now on the scientific basis, on the basis of semiotics, partly replacing rhetoric. The background for this is that in the early 1960s, architects and theorists started to deplore the impoverished state of architecture communication in high modernism. Under pressure of the economy of scarcity in the post-war years, modern architecture had lost much of its original appeal. 3 points of criticism were raised in the 1960s in the context of postmodernism, we can say. First, the loss of language. With the abandonment of the ornament, modern architecture had somehow lost its language, or popular language, we could say. Loss of historicity. With the abandonment of the ornament, architecture has lost its tie to history, and subsequently, it had lost part of its identity. Thirdly, the loss of autonomy. With the abandonment of the ornament, architecture had come under the dictate of instrumental reason, resulting in a reduction of architecture to its mere functional aspects. Architecture was ruled by profitability, analysis, and cost efficiency. So, these are the 3 critiques of architecture in the 1960s. Modernism postmodernism was the answer to that. On the basis of semiotics, postmodern architecture started as a critique of high modernist architecture and its loss of language, historicity, and autonomy. This was summarized by the British architecture critic Charles Jenks in the book The Language of Modern Architecture. In this book, Jenks gives the precise place, day and hour of the death of modern architecture. According to Jenks, it all happened in St. Louis, Missouri on July 15, 1972 at the precise hour of 3:32. Luckily for the death of modern architecture, a clear time can be given, isn't it? According to Jenks, this housing complex was exemplary for the instrumental reason of high capitalism, for the dominance of cost efficiency and economic self-interest that ruled much of post-war architecture in the 1950s and 60s. By the way, this housing complex, which was blown was designed by an architect. His name is Minoru Yamasaki. He's also the architect of the World Trade Center. Interestingly enough, the buildings of these architects had really bad luck. Yet, there's something worrisome about the talk of the language of architecture. The question is whether the term language of architecture reasonably describes the way architecture communicates. Certainly, architecture is a means of mass communication. We may even talk about architecture as the oldest means of mass communication, as all buildings communicate something that is beyond the pure technical facts and the instrumental reason of architecture. But again, what justifies the talk about a language of architecture? I would hold that the term language of architecture actually reveals a certain misconception of architecture. To talk about a language of architecture misses out on some of the distinguishing features of architectural science. That architectural science are distinguished from linguistic science, and just let me repeat the 3 points. Architectural science are material science. They have a certain physical presence. They're always present, since they are always placed in a certain 3-dimensional context. And they ask for the realization of their meaning in a performative act. So in contrast to linguistic science, in architecture, signs are not only placeholders for something else. They do not only point to or refer to other things, but they are the thing itself. In an act of auto-reference, they point to themselves. So it is important to understand that generally linguistic signs are considered things that stand for something else, for something which is not present. So Augustine, the early Christian monk and theologian, brought it to the formula of aliquid stat pro aliquo, or a sign is something that stands for something other. Signs are by definition things that refer to something else but are never the thing itself. For example, if I use the word tree, it stands for something out there in the park with green leaves in summer, but the word tree is not the tree. So we can summarize. Signs, images, photos, paintings included, often stand for something absent. Linguistic signs are the basis that we can communicate or exchange ideas about things that are not present. This is the special thing about language. Linguistic signs make it possible that we talk about things that are momentarily absent. For this reason, signs are the basis for science, art, theology, and religion, for example. This is a fantastic thing about language, that we can talk about absent things, that we can talk about Africa now, about dreams, feelings, that we communicate about other things that are not present in this room. However, unlike architectural science, linguistic science are arbitrary science and what we can call unmotivated science. As for example, a written word that refers to a real thing is totally different from the thing it refers to. I just tried to explain to you. Just take the word bird. It stands for the species of animals that can fly. But the word you call this animal is arbitrary. It's totally arbitrary. In one language you call it bird, in another language you call it vogel, in German, French oiseau, in Italian uccellino, Japanese tori, and please help me, this seems to be the Russian word for bird, no? No?
Pizza.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. So these signs are placeholders. They stand representative for certain things, and their appearance, their shape, form, figure is based on convention. This is why we call linguistic science arbitrary or unmotivated science, or science by convention. But this is not so with architectural signs. Architectural signs are not arbitrary. Apart from some variations, a door is a door. It is an opening in a wall through which one must be able to walk through. If you cannot walk through, if you can only look through, you say it's a window. It is bound, so it is bound on a certain appearance and to a certain function. So please let me bring this first part to a conclusion. We can say it is interesting to notice that the various semioticians like Ferdinand de Saussure, Peirce, Roman Jacobson, Umberto Eco, Nelson Goodman, and so on make only marginal reference to architecture for good reason. As architectural signs are different due to their materiality, presence, and performance, they are different because they are different to the before mentioned. Because they are different, the before mentioned theories seem to be unable to include architectural signs in their semiotic system. This is why these semioticians only refer scarcely, marginally to architecture. And it's not really convincing. It is astounding, although architecture is the most central mass medium in any culture. Yet, we do not exactly know how it works semiotically. By large, semiotic theories that explain us architecture are missing. So my lecture is conceived as an approach to the theory of architecture semiotics. Architecture semiotics must go beyond the semiotic models of linguistics. It must go beyond mere semiotics of the image too. Hence, what I propose is what I dare to call a phenomenological extension of the semiotic models of linguistics and the science of the image. This is to what the title of my lecture refers to, the presence of the sign towards a phenomenological semiotics in architecture. Since by now the basic semiotic elements are introduced that allow to distinguish architectural sign from linguistic signs and images, now we are ready to tackle the question, what exactly makes architectural signs so special? So, please let me turn to what I want to call the triple epistemological ambivalence of the architectural signs. So in regard to the architectural sign, we can distinguish three different modes of perception. This is due to the fact that the meaning of an architectural sign is always a function of the spatial position or the changing spatial position of the observer. What we perceive and understand changes according to how we perceive architecture in regard to the spatial relation between the observer and the architectural sign. Three cases can be classified. First case. The understanding of an architectural sign depends on the distance of the observer to the architectural object. We can talk about a kind of zooming aspect. For example, we all know the effect that from a certain perspective, objects may seem to be very close to one another. Seen from another angle, we may learn that there in reality is no relationship at all between them. This often happens when we look from far away and from different angles at the silhouette of a city. Just like this, you think the Campanile of San Marco is very close to the church of Santa Maria della Salute, but then in reality it is not. Or if you look at this, we think this ship is plowing through the city. It is not. There's a canal behind it. But if you don't know, you think it's a miracle. What's going on? Often also from far away, architectural objects seem to emanate a clear message. Towers, for example, bell towers of churches, have a clear message. But once you approach the building, a lot of new signs in a different scale appear that at times may tell you a contradictory story of the large form. The church might be secularized, the church might have been turned into a restaurant or a supermarket, or the tower only looks like a campanile, while in reality it is an office building, like in this case in New York. So in the close in the close architectural, at close distance, architectural signs may tell you a different story from as they tell you from far away. But of course, there are also buildings that tell you the same story in all the details. It is based on a very conscious design decision if in the large overall scale a building conveys the same message as in the small scales. Just like in the case of this building, the Palazzo della Giustizia in Trieste in Italy. So in the large scale, this building exhibits all the elements of power. The high rusticating stucco, the portico with its columns, the consoles that hold up the window frame. So let's mix this one here. The trisection of the building, the symmetrical organization, and so on. All these elements make the building a very authoritarian building in its way, what it communicates. And at the same the same style rules the smaller scale details, the socle, the window frames, the balustrades, the lattice work, for example, here. This all tells the same message. So this is different with linguistic signs. The word man or the word bird you can write in different sizes. It remains the same. You can go very close or almost hit the screen with your nose, still the meaning does not change. But in architecture we have this kind of zoom effect where often things tell a different story in the detail than they do in the larger scale. So second case, due to the three-dimensionality of architectural objects, in general architectural signs can only be perceived partially. Professor Posner was referring to this yesterday. The understanding of an architectural object is only partially based on visual conception. There's always also a cognitive element present. It's not only visual. Houses are always given a perspectival display, hence we can only see a certain part of it. For example, if we see the front facade and the front facade we cannot see the front facade and the back side at the same time. The German philosopher Edmund Husserl called it Abschattung, what could be translated into English as shadowing. In the process of understanding, we complement the part that is hidden from visual perception. We somehow complement it. It's not the case with words. So as opposed to linguistic signs, architectural signs have an outside and an inside, a front side and a back side. And these back sides or insides are part of the sign. Why are they part of the sign? Can we just neglect these aspects and limit the architecture to what we just see? No, we can't. Since, for example, we walk around the house, then the back side is visible and turns into the front side, and the other side, which we have seen before, disappears from our sight. What we are still looking at the same, but we are still looking at the same building and at the same sign. This is why we have to consider the entire building in its three-dimensionality as the sign of a house. So it's the back part, we cannot just neglect the back part and say we concentrate on what we see. Because if you go around the house, the back side turns into the front side and the front facade turns into back facade. Once you move around the house, it's still the same house, it's still the same sign in the larger scale. So in our daily routine, we always add in our imagination those parts that are hidden from vision. With the help of our memory, we complement the house in our brain. This means that we do not only see and perceive architectural signs, but also partly make them up by complementing the invisible part. That is, architectural signs are partly visual, partly cognitive. Actually, they are almost always both visual and cognitive. But often architectural signs help us to envision the missing part. There are indicators that give some indication to what is hidden. For example, an open door indicates that there is something behind. Seeing a person looking out of a window on the 5th floor of a building, for example, indicates that behind the facade there must be floors and ceilings, there must be staircases that make it plausible that the person was able to climb up and look out of the window on the 5th floor. So in this sense, most architectural signs are indexes or indexical signs, or also indicators. Indexes are signs that do not only refer to something else, but instead are connected. Instead, there is a connection to the thing they refer to. There's a real connection to the thing they refer to. Charles Sanders Peirce says, an index stands for its object by virtue of a real connection with it, or because it forces the mind to attend to that object. Or he says, an index marks the junction between two portions of experience. Like a shadow is an index of the sun. It marks two portions of an experience, the sun and the shadow, or the surface where the shadow is cast to. There's a real relationship between shadow and sun, or a footstep in the snow. It is an index of the shoe and of the person that had walked by a while ago. But also, open doors are indexes. The hinges of a door, for example, here. Sorry, the hinges of the door, you see it on the right picture, the hinges of the door handle and these kind of things. They are all indexes of how, of the function of the door. How the door works and how it is fixed to the wall. A wall itself is an indexical science, and it shows how it is made, especially a brick wall. It shows how it is made. The masonry bond shows the process of construction. You see here exactly how the thing is made. So the process of making, which I referred to in my first lecture in regard to ornament, is also in here. So we could almost say this is an ornament. Only there might be missing the second part, the anthropological part, the strong side. So the other side is very weak. The anthropological side is rather weak here. But do you see how the thing is made? No? So it's indexical to the making process of the building. So the arch, for example, you have here two arches. So the brick bond, how it is made. So architectural sign often, in most cases, show indexical signs because they show something, or they tell something, or communicate something about how they were made. So as a matter of fact, all architectural signs are indexical signs because all things in action tell you something about how they are made, how they were put together, and how they should be used and how they function. But anyway, this is why Husserl, the German philosopher, was able to state that our perception and understanding of the physical world is made of in German it's a System von Verweisen, or in English a system of references. It is indexical, and since there is a real connection between the sign and the hidden thing that is present but not visible, we can call it a system of indexical references of various kinds. So architecture is made of references, a system of references, or a system of hidden indexical references. So what do we do with these houses? Holds the above said also true for modern architecture, or architecture in high modernist style? What is the indexicality here, we ask ourselves. So this is exactly what postmodernity criticized. That the classical modern white box does not communicate anymore. It does not explain itself, or it does not tell the story of its making, or even worse, it's too intellectual, it communicates only with experts, with architects and architecture theories, but not with common man. as I showed you in the example of the corner of the alumni hall of Mies van der Rohe. This communicates, it shows what, it is an indicator, it's an ornament, at the same time an indicator, but only for the person which is knowledgeable about architecture. So this is one of the problems of modern architecture, as you see here, but there are also advantages to modern architecture, of course. Since modern architecture in the end somehow shift from semiotics to phenomenology. So it's from design to atmosphere, to space, to experience of space. So it somehow there's a shift towards a phenomenological field, which produces a lot of interesting things. So we can wrap up this part and state the reading of the architecture sign is a combination of visual and cognitive processes. Visual perception in architecture means to supplement the visual with the invisible, always. In general, architectural science are indexical science. So let me come to my third point here, which is probably the most important point in regard to visual communication and visual perception in architecture. We can state, the process of reading architecture can be understood as a series of transformations of the architectural scene. What are those transformations? This is the question. Take Goethe's summer house in the Innenpark in Weimar. By strolling through the park at a certain point, the view opens up, and in the far distance, on the other side of a meadow, beautiful meadow, the walker will see a house, which can be easily recognized as Goethe's summer house by its characteristic shape. Everybody knows this house almost. The particular proportions of the roof, the 6 windows in the main facades, can you see them? The typical fence that surrounds the house and the garden, all these signs tell the walker that this must be Goethe's summer house. However, by further approaching the house, the visitor will make a puzzling observation. As he approaches the house, 5 of the windows turn into real windows, while 1 window does not follow the transformation. Instead, it becomes clearly visible as a painted window. So it's on the left hand corner, upper corner. So it is merely an image of a window painted on the wall. It is interesting because it tells us that architectural science cannot always be distinguished from images. It needs a certain propinquity or closeness to the object to discriminate architectural science from pure images. Only when we understand that 5 of the 6 windows are real windows in the wall that create certain connections between inside and outside. But then a second transformation is likely to happen. At a certain point, the visitor, still approaching the building, may enter the building, go up to the 2nd floor and open one of the windows, realizing, as we can say, the meaning of the architectural sign window by looking out of the window or letting the air in or out. So with the realization of the window function, a third transformation happens, but less with the architectural sign window than with the mode how we or the person perceives the architectural sign. In the moment when the person sticks out his head of the window, in this moment the mode of perception changes from an act of visual perception to an act of performative perception. This then involves more than visual perception. It involves some of our other senses, like listening, touching, feeling, body feeling. So when the building first entered the visual field of the spectator, it was the eye that read the architectural sign from afar. Though when the visitor opens the window, In this third stage, it is the body with all the other senses that is actively realizing the window in a kind of performative act. This is obvious since in the act of sticking out one's head off the window, the person cannot see the window anymore. But he starts to feel the change in atmosphere, the fresh air, or the odor of spring. Our observation allows us to complement the scheme of 4 distinguishing features of architectural science, or complement the 3 schemes, and add a 4th category. It now looks like this. We have a pictorial level from far away from architecture, where we cannot really distinguish whether it's a real window or a painted window. We have the material level from close, where we discover the materiality. Then we have the phenomenological level from close, which is about the presence of the window, and a performative level from very close. So it's a performative quality when we actually open the window or stick out our head. So in a laboratory situation, like the situation of our visitor to the Eden Park found himself, architectural science turned from pictorial level to the phenomenological level, and finally to the performative level. On the first level, architectural science behaves like images, like pictorial science. The observer cannot exactly tell whether a thing is only painted or made of real things. This is about semiotics of the image. But it is the last 3 aspects that make the difference between images and linguistic science and architectural science. It is the materiality and the presence of the sign and the possibility for the performative realization of its meaning that mark the difference. And exactly here an architectural semiotic has to get started. The above observation leads to an insight that is crucial to the understanding of architectural sign. If we think that the performative realization distinguishes architectural science from linguistic science, then we must come to the following conclusion. As we can infer from the above said, function is an integral part of the architectural sign. This is, I think, very important. Function is also a sign, is part of the sign. It has to be included into the definition of architectural science, the semiotics. This marks a difference in regard to the conventional sign theories or the semantics of the image, because these theories and the semantics of the image, because they exclude function from semiotics. For example, take the following situation. We see a door at the end of the corridor. Or better, we believe to see a door at the end of the corridor, on the left-hand side or the right-hand side. There is something. But what we see is an image of a door, since we cannot be sure whether it is real or painted. We cannot decide yet. It might be only painted. Most of the architectural science in everyday life we perceive on this stage, first stage of the triadic order of image. If we walk, for example, on a street in Tomsk, most of what we see is architectural science on the pictorial level. We cannot be sure whether high up on the 10th floor of a high-rise building, the sign of a window is a real window or whether it is only painted. Many architectural signs remain on this level or very far away. It could be also a kind of canvas painted. It could be a kind of Potemkin village. Many architectural signs remain on this level. We cannot verify whether they are made of real materials or whether they are just painted. Only those signs which we are able to see from a certain close distance, switch to the phenomenological level. And for these signs, the probability for the realization of the meaning of the sign in the performative act is much higher. And sincerely, we walk through only very few doors. And we look through only very few windows. most of the architectural science door we do not performatively realize or experience in the architectural presence. We only perceive them either on the pictorial level, from far away, or on the phenomenological level. And this is, I think, very important to understand. This is an example for a mock-up of the Berlin castle. They wanted to convince people that we should rebuild the castle. And it's a mock-up. From far away, you cannot tell whether this is a painting or not. It was a painting. It was canvas painting and put up on a scaffolding behind. And this happens with much of our architectural experience. Now we can classify the three stages of the architectural design. In reference to the German philosopher Ernst Cassirer, we can draw a first classification. So we have the symbolic form on the pictorial level, what we would call symbolic pregnance. Symbolic pregnance 2, one on the material, one on the phenomenological level, and symbolic performance on the performative level. And you see I'm drawing here a dotted line which distinguishes the part which belongs to the semantics of the image, and the ones below, they distinguish the architectural semiotics. So we come now to the next part, where I want to explain to you, make you some examples. And the topic is autonomous versus sovereign architectural design. Now let me make some examples to see what this theory's analytical potential is in architecture. Does our triadic system of architectural science help to better understand architecture? Does it even help in the process of making architecture? For this purpose, I want to present to you two architects who took the linguistic turning architecture very serious. Both engaged in a lifelong debate over architecture and semiotics. Eventually, they found themselves on the opposite sides of architectural semiotics. The one architect is Robert Venturi, an American architect. He's the author of two very famous books. One called is Complexity and Contradiction. It's very much about communication in architecture. And the other one is Learning from Las Vegas, where he developed a certain architectural design theory, although on a very basic level. Both books promote a kind of semiotic reconceptualization of architecture, vaguely in the context of the linguistic turn of the 1960s. Throughout his architecture career, Venturi was concerned with architectural semiotics. That is, he was concerned to turn architectural science into almost literally linguistic science. So much he was influenced by the linguistic turn, or at least he tried to push architectural science as much as possible to the side of linguistics. This means to push the architectural science to the first level of the three levels, thus trying to turn it into an image. You may have guessed it, it resulted in a process of defunctionalization and dematerialization of the architectural sign. Venturi's interest was to make the architectural sign autonomous like a linguistic sign, so autonomous from material and function. You are probably curious now how this can work, the dematerialization and defunctionalization of architecture. Well, I will show you just in a minute. So the other architect is James Stirling, a British architect. From the beginning of his career, also he was interested in architecture semiotics. He eventually became one of the most successful modern architects, a postmodern architect, with his architecture the most postmodern of all postmodern architecture. He is probably the architect that understood best the specific triadic organization of the architectural design. His strategy was neither the dematerialization nor the defunctionalization of the architectural sign. Instead, he did the opposite to Venturi. He emphasized the material presence, as well as he strengthened the performative function of architecture. By strengthening the material presence and the performative function of the sign, of the architectural sign, Stirling strived for what I would call the sovereignty of the architectural sign. So please let me turn to the first example, to Venturi. Firstly, I want to show you Venturi's famous column of the Museum of Arts in Berlin in Missouri, somewhere in the Midwest of the United States. So this column epitomizes best the semiotic inventions of Venturi. Once you have understood the semiotic technique of Venturi applied to this column, I think you will be able to understand all of his other buildings, how they semiotically work. So this column is clearly marked as standing in the tradition of a classical Ionic column. You talked about it already. There is an iconic reference to the classical iconic column, but Venturi tried everything to turn the column into a linguistic sign. He dematerialized the column, he deplaced it, and he prevented the column from the realization of its architectural meaning as a load-bearing architectural element. Let's have a close look. And unfortunately, the beamer somehow distorts a little bit the images. But okay. So first of all, unlike a classical column, this column is made of wood. But the body of the column is not a solid piece of wood, which could bear some load. Instead, it is composed of many single wooden slabs, which are somehow nailed or screwed to a supporting invisible structure. As we know from experience, these wooden slats, with really slim things, are not able to bear any load. It is interesting, though, to notice that iconographically, the joints between the vertical slats somehow seem to refer to the vertical order of the classical Ionic column, the so-called canelure, the canelures, which I already showed to you, or you see it here on the left-hand side. But then, look what the architecture did with the volutes, these pieces here. It is a flat piece of wood, in this case. It is not a three-dimensional element anymore, like in the original. In the original column, the volute is thought to translate the load-bearing function into an image. The volutes illustrate how the building loads weigh heavily on the column, squashing or compressing the material. You can almost feel how the material is squeezed out under the architrave, under the weight. Nothing like this happens in Venturi's columns. It doesn't communicate these things. No weight, no counterforce to the load, no compression, no deformation, and no translation of the forces into an image. And there's a third element. On a closer look, you notice that this column is detached from the building above. It is separated by a gap. This is a clear indicator that this column is not load-bearing. It means that if the semiotic meaning of a column originally is that it is able to bear the load from above, this column is not able to perform its semantic meaning. It's not load-bearing, it just stands there. It's just almost an image. It's not anymore an architectural element in the real sense. This demonstrates that there are at least three elements that show us that this column is only a sign or an image of a column. But definitively, it is not an architectural sign, or it lacks most of the features of an architectural sign. This column stays on the pictorial level of our triadic system. Or take this project of the Flint house, also of me too. Everything is flat, the Doric columns are flat, they are meant to be flat as painted here or drawn here. The tympanum or the pediment is more a kind of lattice structure which is combined with the grid of a modern glass facade behind. The columns are supposed to support the tympanum, but they are displaced. They do not stand where they are expected to stand according to the code of architecture. For example, at the corner of this pediment, there the column is this column. It should stay here, but not here. Here the column is pushed towards the middle of the building. And as you can feel, all these columns are not supposed to be at any load. And if they do so, then in any case, they are oversized. So these are images. So these architectural elements are reduced to images. And anyway, classical Doric columns, by definition, by convention, by tradition, are not meant to support a pediment or family house. Everything remains on pictorial level here in this case, in a free combination of classical elements, oversized, displaced, and dematerialized. The individual architectural elements are freely collaged together like words, disregarding the grammar of architecture. The result is a free composition, an all too free composition. One does not even know whether this is a joke, whether this is irony, whether one can call it pastiche or collage or whatsoever. We can state now that Venturi is pushing for an autonomous status of the architectural sign. He frees the single architectural sign from its materiality, from its presence, and from its function. Architecture is intentionally pushed over the borderline towards the pictorial. Where did Venturi get his ideas from? Well, from the two books he wrote, which I mentioned to you. Well, on the basis of the linguistic term, the idea, though, derived from his famous study of the architecture of Las Vegas in the 1970s. The book is called Learning from Las Vegas. In this book, he was trying to show how the city and architecture and the semiotics of architecture change once you do not walk anymore in the city, but only drive your car. You're only cruising the city. Because of the higher velocity or speed, because of the speed, so of the cars, signs, advertisements, billboards have to grow. And behind the oversized buildings, the houses themselves almost disappear. For this, Venturi coined the very famous term of the decorated shed. So architecture becomes a decorated shed, and this is very well depicted here in this left-hand project of him. The column in the Oberlin museum, or the Flint house, or this here, both follow the idea of the decorated shed. For a lifetime, Venturi did only decorated sheds. He even said that classical architecture, for a good part, is also decorated sheds. So I think the left-hand image, with the left-hand image, you can imagine what it means, a decorated shed. You know? Its sign is separated from the house behind. The house behind is not meant anymore to communicate. It's just a functional building with no communication. And the architecture, the real architectural signs are detached from the building's construction like this and turned into signs. Linguistic signs, not architectural signs. So let's turn now to the architecture of James Stirling. I have 10 minutes left. He does exactly the opposite of what Venturi does. Stirling pushes for the sovereignty of the architectural sign. For this purpose, he persuades a tactic of strengthening all of the three semiotic aspects of the architectural sign. That is, to strengthen the level of symbolic form, the level of symbolic pregnance, and the level of symbolic performance. Let's have a look at his entrance gate of the Stuttgart Staatsgalerie. On the pictorial, formal level, the entrance pavilion here, which you see here, is alluding to another figure, very famous figure in architecture, in the architectural history. First of all, what you see here is a banner hanging in a structure. It's four posts. There's the figure of a roof, a glass roof, the four posts, and the horizontal beams. They are painted blue and red. Actually, on the left-hand side, it's the quality of the photo which turns the blue into red, into black. But on the right-hand side, you see the blue. And it stands somewhere where you have on the right side there's a stair, or it's supposed there's a stair going up. On the left hand side there's a ramp, and in the axis there's a big black hole or door. So on the pictorial level, let's say on the formal level of the entrance pavilion is alluding to the figure of what we call the so-called primordial prototypical house, as it was, for example, presented by Abbé Lochier in the middle of the 18th century. This is a very famous drawing, part of the essay of Abbé Lochier, where it talks about the first house. How the first house looked like, where does architecture come from? And this is his solution. It's four trees, and you have some horizontal beams, and then you have this triangular structure, it's a pediment, and that's what his imagination about the first house. Lochier imagined the first house as constructed, as I just said, between four trees and so on. This means that on the pictorial level, Stirling's entrance pavilion as an architectural sign refers to Abbé Lochier's fantasy of the primordial hut. But on the phenomenological level of material, this was our second aspect. The pavilion does not follow the defaults of Lochier, since Stirling uses steel and not wood. So there's on the level of the material, here there happens a certain estrangement. So the figure, the signs, the different signs level do not fit anymore. So we can say primordial hut. On the figural level, there's a strong symbolic form. This little house entrance pavilion refers as a sign to the primordial house as envisioned by Abbé Lochier. But on the material level, it's a weak. So there's a weak symbolic pregnancy because there's a certain kind of estrangement. And even on the functional level, since this is not a house to live in, but an entrance pavilion, also here we have he weakens this sign, the sign quality on this level. So he strengthened the overall architectural sign on one level, and he weakens them by a technique of estrangement. The technique of estrangement was first introduced into art theory by the Russian Viktor Shklovsky in his in a very famous text, which is called Art as Estrangement, although he talks, the argument is actually the opposite. Art as estrangement. This is exactly his topic. So let's get back again. Maybe you can understand it better now that on the formal level of our three levels, he strengthens the form, but he weakens the form on the other two levels. But it's not that there is no material, that there is no presence anymore, like in the examples of Venturi. No, it's still, there's a strong presence, and the strong presence comes through other elements. And if you look at this thing from a perspective of the material now, and not from a formal level, then the thing looks a little bit different. So there is the material steel, actually blue and red colored steel and glass. This means if we look from the perspective of the material, if this is our point of view, if this is our what we want to focus on mainly, or approach to the thing, we find a strong reference to industrial architecture of the 19th century. This is typical, you know, this material, of course, is a reference to the architecture of the 19th century, industrial architecture. It's architecture of the modern age. Steel and glass are very typical for architecture, for industrial architecture. So this is repeated several times throughout the building, by the way, the other pieces of architecture. For example, in the canopies in front of the various entrance doors. So from this perspective, from the perspective of the material, the chart looks now a little bit different. So there's a strong presence of the symbolic presence in terms when we look to the material, but the figure, this figure does not really make a lot of sense in the context of industrial architecture. So it's weak form, weak symbolic form. It's also a weak symbolic performance, because architecture, industrial architecture would ask for other kind of functions than just an entrance pavilions. So it depends on how we look at these things. So once we look on the figural thing, then the material and the presence of the figure, of the element is weak. If we look at from the perspective of the material, which is very strong, then the other two things become weak. Then, yet there's another possibility of interpretation now with the approach from the performative level. So on the level of the realization of the function. The meaning on the performative level is entrance, clearly, which is marked by the position of this architectural element. It's only where you can enter. Additional secondary signs like the banner with the logo of the city of Stuttgart and the name of the museum in large letters on it let infer that this must be the entrance. There is the symmetry of the pavilion, the stairs on the right and the ramp on the left, and in the center there is this hole which clearly indicates entrance. And what do the visitors do? Well, they want to enter the building through this door, to the black hole, of course. Everything indicates that this is the main entrance. Assuming, so they entered through this door, assuming that this is the main entrance to the museum. And what they do, what they actually, so they go straight through the door, and what they find, it's the parking garage. It's not the entrance to the museum. So this means on the third level, the meaning of the architectural sign entrance cannot be performatively realized. The visitor have to go back and take either the stairs to the right or the ramp to the left, although nothing tells them which of the two possibilities lead to the real entrance of the building. So the visitor is somehow caught in a very intelligent game of a permanent diversion or estrangement of meaning on all three levels: on the level of the symbolic level, on the level of symbolic form, on the level of symbolic pregnance, and on the level of symbolic performance. But the architectural sign is very strong on all three levels: strong form, strong material location, and strong performative potential. So for the third level, the level of symbolic performance, we can draw the following chart. So that we have, it's entrance pavilion. So on the level of performance, we have a strong symbolic, on the level of function, there's a strong symbolic performance, while the other two levels, so the symbolic pregnance and symbolic form, are weak in this case. So it is amazing that with each single architectural element, Stirling plays the same game of estrangement on all three levels. he establishes strong reference on all three levels, but weakens it on the other two levels by a very refined technique of estrangement. So this creates a very strong tension. Although mutually contradicting themselves, all three sign aspects are present and very strong. There's of course much more to say, though we can call this a technique of semiotic sovereignty, in contrast, or no position, to a technique of semiotic autonomy of the architectural sign. So this is a perfect transfer of the idea of the so-called floating signifier from the field of linguistics to the field of architecture, without giving up the essential properties of architecture, that is, its materiality, its presence, and its performance. So in the case of the Stuttgart Staatsgalerie, Stirling treats all, I repeat, all architectural elements in the same way, throughout the whole building. Sometimes the effect is stronger and more effective as in the other cases, but in general we always witness a kind of effect of semiotic strengthening on one level, at the same time counterbalanced by a technique of estrangement on the other two levels. Point, period. This is the end of the lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.